Sarah Jenkins vanished on a Tuesday. The official record notes the date as May 15, 2001, a night when a violent thunderstorm broke over Washington, D.C., rattling the Capitol's stately windows. Inside the prestigious Georgetown law firm of Croft, Sterling & Dunn, the storm was a distant, muted percussion against soundproof glass. This is where Elena Ramirez, a 22-year-old cleaner, became the last person to see the young paralegal alive. She saw her arguing in a hushed, frantic tone with Julian Croft, the firm's golden boy, down a long mahogany-paneled hallway. An hour later, all that remained of Sarah was an abandoned desk, a computer screen glowing with an unfinished email, a purse hanging on the back of her chair, and a half-empty mug of tea, still faintly warm to the touch. The woman herself was simply gone, erased from the opulent, secure building as if she had never been there at all. Before that night, Elena's life was a world away from Georgetown's quiet wealth. Contained within the walls of a cramped apartment in Columbia Heights, her days began in the late afternoon, waking to the rich smell of her mother, Sophia, frying plantains, the scent clinging to the worn curtains and faded floral sofa. Their home was a soundtrack of resilience. The sizzle of oil in a pan, the rhythmic Spanish of a telenovela from the small television, the cacophony of meringue and car horns bleeding through the open window from the street below. Sophia's hands, chapped and weary from 2 jobs, would gently braid Elena's hair before she left for her own. It was a life built on a quiet, shared exhaustion, and the unspoken fear of their precarious existence, a silent pact to remain invisible in a country that felt both like a refuge and a threat. The journey to work was a daily crossing of invisible borders. Elena would board the 42 bus, the vibrant energy of her neighborhood gradually giving way to the manicured austerity of the city's powerful core. She would watch as the faces changed, the languages faded, and the buildings grew taller and more imposing, their stone facades seeming to absorb the light and sound around them. By the time she stepped onto the brick-lined sidewalks of Georgetown, she had perfected the art of becoming unseen. Her posture would shrink slightly, her gaze fixed to the ground, a ghost in a blue smock moving through a world not meant for her. The air here was different, cleaner, quieter, heavy with the scent of money and old, unshakable influence. She was an essential but non-existent part of its nightly ritual, the silent restorer of order in a universe of immense privilege. Her shift began at 10 o'clock, a descent into a cathedral of corporate silence. The law firm of Croft, Sterling & Dunn was a hushed labyrinth of glass walls, thick carpets that swallowed the sound of her footsteps, and the faint, sterile smell of paper and leather. With her cleaning cart and a Walkman playing fuzzy Spanish rock as her only companions, she moved through the deserted offices like a somnambulist. She emptied wastebaskets filled with the debris of high-stakes litigation and catered lunches, polished away the fingerprints of men who shaped legislation, and vacuumed floors that bore the weight of million-dollar decisions. She learned the firm's secrets through its trash. Who was in debt, who was having an affair, who drank too much. She was the keeper of their discarded lives, an intimate stranger who saw everything and was seen by no one. Of all the offices, Julian Croft's was the most immaculate, a shrine to ambition. It sat on the corner, overlooking the dark, churning waters of the Potomac River. Elena knew the precise angle at which he kept the silver-framed photo of his smiling wife, the brand of single malt scotch he favored, and the confident, slashing signature on his discarded notes. He was handsome, charismatic, a man whose future was a foregone conclusion, spoken of in reverent tones by the other partners. To Elena, he wasn't a person but an aura of effortless power that lingered in the room long after he'd gone home. He represented an entire world of men who never had to look at the women who cleaned up after them, who moved through life with the serene confidence that their messes of any kind would always be quietly taken care of. Elena's world was circumscribed by the 4 walls of their Columbia Heights apartment and the late afternoon sun that slanted through the single grime-streaked window. She would wake not to an alarm clock but to the gentle, persistent sizzle of oil in a pan, a sound that was the true start of her day. Her mother, Sophia, would already be moving through the small kitchen, a stooped but determined shadow, her hands working with an ingrained muscle memory that defied her exhaustion. The air would be thick and comforting, a rich tapestry woven from the scents of fried plantains, strong black coffee, and the faint, sweet smell of the floor cleaner Sophia used every morning. It was the smell of survival, a daily renewal of their small, precarious existence in a city that barely knew they were there. Sophia's hands told the story of their life more eloquently than words ever could. They were chapped, the knuckles swollen, the skin permanently stained from years of harsh cleaning chemicals and scalding dishwater, Yet these same hands were impossibly gentle when they touched Elena's cheek or smoothed a stray hair from her forehead. They moved with a quiet efficiency, a testament to a life spent working for others. Sofia rarely spoke of El Salvador, but the trauma lived in the deep lines around her eyes and the way she would startle at the sound of a backfiring car. Her love for Elena was a fierce, silent thing, a protective shield against a world she fundamentally distrusted, a world that had already taken too much from her once before. Their apartment was a testament to making do. A floral print sofa, its springs groaning in protest, was pushed. Against one wall, its pattern faded from years of sunlight and use. A small, plastic-covered dining table with two mismatched chairs occupied the center of the room. On the wall above the small television, a crucifix hung next to a faded photograph of a family Elena barely remembered. Aunts, uncles, and cousins left behind in another life. The space was meticulously clean but perpetually crowded. Every surface holding an object, every corner filled. It was a home built not on possessions but on the sheer force of Sofia's will to create a sanctuary, however small, against the vast, indifferent city that lay just outside their door, humming with a life they could only observe. Dinner was their sacred ritual, a brief interlude between Sofia's two jobs and the beginning of Elena's long night. They would sit at the small table, the tinny sound of a Spanish-language telenovela providing a dramatic backdrop to their quiet meal. The food was always simple, nourishing, and deeply familiar. Black beans, rice, and whatever Sofia had managed to cook between her shifts. They ate with the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other's thoughts without needing to voice them. They spoke of small things, a funny incident on the bus, a demanding guest at the hotel where Sofia worked, carefully navigating around the larger unspoken anxieties of rent, bills, and the constant low-grade fear of their undocumented status. It was a fragile piece, cherished all the more for its brevity. Before leaving, Elena would change into her nondescript uniform. Sturdy dark blue pants and a matching polo shirt, clothes designed for invisibility. Sofia would then perform the last act of her maternal day, her tired fingers expertly weaving Elena's long dark hair into a tight, practical braid. It was a gesture of love, a final touch of home before Elena stepped out into the night. She would pack Elena's meager lunch, leftovers from their dinner in a worn plastic container, and press a few dollars into her hand for the bus. Con cuidado, mija, she would whisper, the same gentle warning every single night. Be careful. It was a prayer, a plea and a command, all wrapped in the soft cadence of her mother's voice, a talisman Elena carried with her into the darkness. The 42 bus was a vessel that transported Elena across the city's invisible divides. It started its journey in the vibrant chaos of her neighborhood, filled with the sounds of Spanish and Amharic, the air thick with the smells of 100 different kitchens. As it rumbled downtown, the demographics would subtly shift. The music from portable stereos would fade, replaced by the rustle of newspapers and the quiet tapping of laptops. By the time it reached the manicured streets of Georgetown, the bus was nearly empty. Its remaining passengers mostly service workers like her, all sharing a collective, weary silence. Elena would watch the city transform through the window, the brightly lit storefronts and stately brick townhouses feeling like a scene from a movie she was not a part of. Over time, Elena had perfected the art of being unseen. In her neighborhood, she moved with a natural ease, but as she traveled closer to the city's heart of power, she would begin to shrink. Her shoulders would hunch slightly, her eyes would fix on the pavement in front of her steps becoming quieter, more deliberate. She learned to modulate her presence, to become a passing shadow that registered in no one's memory. Her Walkman was her only shield, the fuzzy guitars of a favorite rock en español band creating a private soundtrack that insulated her from the profound alienation she felt. She was a ghost gliding through the opulent world of the powerful, a necessary but utterly forgotten component of its nightly maintenance. There had been a time, before the crushing weight of responsibility settled in, when Elena had dreams of her own. Tucked away in a shoebox under her bed was an old sketchbook filled with surprisingly detailed drawings of faces she'd seen on the bus, of the gnarled trees in Meridian Hill Park, of her mother's hands as they kneaded dough. She had a good eye, a quiet talent that had never been nurtured. She had once thought of community college, of maybe taking an art class, but those thoughts felt like luxuries from another lifetime. Now her purpose was singular and stark: to work, to help her mother, to survive. The sketchbook remained a silent testament to a different path, a life unlived. Its pages filled with the ghosts of her abandoned ambitions. The pressure of money was a constant, dull ache in the background of their lives. Every dollar was counted, every expense scrutinized. The rent for their small apartment was a monthly mountain they had to climb, and any unexpected cost, a doctor's visit, a broken appliance, was a potential catastrophe. Sofia sent a small portion of their earnings back to a sister in El Salvador, a non-negotiable tribute to the family they had left behind. This financial fragility was the chain that bound Elena to her nocturnal job. The thought of quitting was impossible. The law firm, for all its alienating grandeur, offered a steady, reliable paycheck. It was a trade-off she made every night, her time, her energy, and her invisibility in exchange for the fragile security their family so desperately needed. Despite its hardships, their life in Columbia Heights was not without its community. There was a shared understanding among the residents of their building, a solidarity born of common struggle. A nod from Mrs. Castillo from the third floor. A shared laugh with the Ethiopian family who ran the corner market. The sounds of children playing soccer in the alley. These were the small anchors that rooted Elena to a place. Here she was not just the cleaner. She was Sofia's daughter, the quiet girl from 4B. This network of familiar faces and shared languages provided a buffer against the city's indifference. It was a world where her existence was acknowledged, a stark contrast to the sterile anonymity that awaited her each night across town, where she was known only by the function she performed. Sofia's fear was a constant, palpable presence in their home. It manifested in her repeated warnings to Elena. Keep your head down. Do not make trouble. Do not speak unless spoken to. We are guests here, she would say, her voice low and serious. Guests must be quiet and grateful. This caution was born from the trauma of the war and the precariousness of their legal status. To be noticed was to be at risk. She saw danger everywhere. In a police car cruising down the street, in a landlord's inquisitive questions, in any interaction with authority. Her deepest terror was that some unforeseen event would draw the attention of the wrong people, unraveling the fragile life they had so painstakingly built and leading to the ultimate catastrophe: deportation. The physical toll of the job was relentless. Elena's body was in a constant state of low-grade protest. A persistent ache settled in her lower back from hours of pushing a heavy cart and mopping floors. Her hands were often dry and cracked from the industrial-strength cleaning solutions. The sharp chemical smell clinging to her skin long after her shift ended. But the exhaustion ran deeper than her muscles. It was a soul-deep weariness, the result of working against the natural rhythms of the world, of sleeping while the city was awake, and toiling in the profound silence of its empty spaces. It was the exhaustion of being a nocturnal creature, forever living in the shadows cast by other people's lives. Sometimes, on a rare, shared day off, they would allow themselves a small sliver of joy. They might take the bus to the National Mall, not to see the monuments, but to sit on a bench and watch the tourists, feeling for a moment like they were a part of the city's grand spectacle. Or they would walk through the drum circle at Meridian Hill Park, the vibrant, chaotic rhythm a welcome antidote to the oppressive silence of Elena's work. Sofia would buy them a street vendor hot dog, a rare treat, and for a few hours the weight of their lives would lift. These moments were fleeting, but they were everything, small, bright pockets of light that sustained them through the long, dark stretches of work and worry. The contrast between her two worlds was a source of constant, quiet whiplash for Elena. Her apartment was a symphony of life. The clamor of voices through thin walls, the aroma of a dozen different meals cooking, the emotional crescendos of the telenovela. The law firm was a vacuum of sound and scent, a tomb of polished wood and silent ambition. At home she was a daughter, a neighbor, a person. At work she was a function, a pair of hands meant to erase the day's mess. She moved between these two universes every day, a silent commuter between realms of vibrant, struggling life and sterile, immense power, feeling as though she never truly belonged to either one. On a typical night, she would arrive at the grand entrance of Croft, Sterling and Dunn just before 10. The last of the associates would be trickling out, talking on their cell phones, never once glancing in her direction. She would swipe her keycard, the heavy glass door clicking shut behind her, sealing her inside the silent, air-conditioned world. Her first act was always the same. She would pull out her Walkman, carefully place the foam headphones over her ears, and press play. The familiar blast of a distorted guitar was her armor, a private rebellion against the crushing quiet. It was the sound of her own world, a world she carried inside her as she began her nightly ritual of restoring order to a universe that would never see her. The afternoon of Tuesday, May 15th, 2001, began not with an alarm, but with the heavy, oppressive stillness that precedes a summer storm. Elena awoke just after 4, the air in the small apartment already thick and humid, clinging to her skin like a damp cloth. Outside, the sky over Columbia Heights was a bruised, yellowish gray, and the usual symphony of the street seemed muted, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Sophia was already home from her hotel job, moving with a quiet, weary purposefulness in the kitchen. She didn't speak of the strange weather, but Elena could feel her mother's anxiety in the tense set of her shoulders, a familiar barometer for unspoken dangers. The day felt wrong from the moment she opened her eyes, charged with a strange latent energy that had nothing to do with the coming rain. Their late afternoon meal was a quiet affair, a ritual of rice and black beans eaten while the sky outside grew progressively darker. The telenovela on the small television played out its usual dramatic passions, but its sound was a thin veil over the growing tension in the room. Sophia ate slowly, her gaze drifting to the window. "The sky looks angry today," she murmured in Spanish, more to herself than to Elena. She then looked directly at her daughter, her eyes filled with that deep, familiar well of worry. "Be careful tonight, mija. When the weather is like this, people act strangely. Just do your work and come straight home." It was the same advice she always gave, but tonight her voice carried an extra layer of pleading, an intuition she couldn't name but felt in her bones. As Elena changed into her blue uniform, the first distant rumble of thunder echoed through the city. The sound seemed to shake the very foundations of their old building. As always, Sophia stood behind her, her tired hands deftly weaving Elena's long dark hair into a single tight braid. The familiar rhythmic pull was usually a comfort, but tonight each tug felt like a small, insistent warning. When she finished, her hands lingered for a moment on Elena's shoulders. "No te metas en nada," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. "Don't get involved in anything." It was a mantra, a prayer born of a lifetime of learning, that for people like them, invisibility was the surest form of safety. Elena just nodded, unable to voice the unease that was now a cold knot in her stomach. The journey on the 42 bus was like traveling through an apocalyptic landscape. The streetlights flickered on early, casting a sickly orange glow on the rain-slicked streets. Windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the sheets of water that now lashed the city. Inside the bus, the few passengers were silent, their faces illuminated by the brief, ghostly flashes of lightning that lit up the dark interior. Elena stared out the window, her Walkman silent in her lap. She watched the familiar landmarks of her city become alien and menacing in the storm's fury. By the time she stepped off the bus in Georgetown, her thin jacket was already soaked through, and the wind was strong enough to make her stagger. The imposing brick facade of Croft, Sterling and Dunn seemed to glower down at her, its windows dark and unblinking. She swiped her keycard just before 10, the heavy glass door clicking shut behind her with a sound of finality. The silence inside the law firm was absolute, a stark contrast to the raging tempest outside. The air was cool and sterile, smelling faintly of leather and expensive air freshener. But the storm was not entirely absent. It was a distant, percussive drumming against the thick, soundproof windows, a constant, muffled reminder of the chaos being held at bay. Elena pushed her cleaning cart onto the plush carpet, the soft whir of its wheels the only sound in the cavernous lobby. She felt smaller than usual tonight, a solitary figure in a vast, empty cathedral of power, as the world outside seemed to be tearing itself apart. The building felt less like a workplace and more like a tomb. Her routine was a comfort, a series of familiar tasks that anchored her in the unsettling quiet. She started on the lower floors, emptying wastebaskets, wiping down conference tables, and vacuuming the silent hallways. With each floor she ascended, the sound of the storm grew slightly louder, the flashes of lightning more vivid through the expansive windows. She worked methodically, her movements economical and practiced. But her mind kept replaying her mother's words. Don't get involved in anything. She was so lost in her thoughts that she barely noticed the time passing until she reached the 4th floor, the executive level, the heart of the firm's power. It was here, in this hushed corridor of influence, that the ordinary rhythm of her night was about to be irrevocably shattered. It was nearly 11:30 when she saw that Sarah Jenkins was still at her desk, a small pool of light in the otherwise dark office suite. This wasn't entirely unusual. The young paralegal often worked late. Sarah looked up as Elena passed, offering a tired but genuine smile. "Nasty night out there," she said, her voice a little strained. Elena simply nodded, returning a small smile of her own. She continued down the hall toward the partners' offices, a route she had taken hundreds of times. But something felt different. The air was charged with more than just the storm. There was a palpable tension emanating from the end of the corridor, near the small, rarely used records archive, a place where secrets were stored in neat, alphabetized rows. Then she heard it. Her Walkman was off, its batteries dead, and in the profound silence between thunderclaps, she heard the low, urgent murmur of voices. She glanced down the long, mahogany-paneled hallway. Backlit by a window flashing with lightning, she saw two figures, Sarah Jenkins and Julian Croft. They were not shouting. The sound was more intense than that. A hushed, frantic argument, their bodies leaning in close. Croft's posture was rigid, his hand gripping Sarah's arm. Her face, illuminated for a split second by the storm, was pale and fearful. Elena froze, her heart pounding. Her mother's warning screamed in her mind. She immediately averted her gaze, turning her cart with a sudden, sharp movement and pushing it into the nearest office, focusing on the contents of a trash can as if it were the most important thing in the world. An hour later, the storm had lessened to a steady, drumming rain. Elena worked her way back down the hallway, her movements almost robotic as she tried to scrub the image of the argument from her memory. When she reached Sarah's cubicle to empty her small wastebasket, she stopped. The space was empty, but it was not the emptiness of a person who had packed up and gone home for the night. Sarah's purse was still hanging on the back of her chair. Her computer screen was still on, a half-written email glowing in the dark. Beside the keyboard sat a ceramic mug of tea, and when Elena's fingers brushed against it by accident, she found that it was still faintly warm. A deep, chilling sense of wrongness washed over her, a cold dread that the lingering warmth only amplified. She finished her shift in a daze, the remaining hours passing in a blur of disquiet. The image of Sarah's abandoned desk was burned into her mind. She kept expecting to see the paralegal return, to hear her cheerful goodnight. But the fourth floor remained silent. At 6 in the morning, as the first gray light of dawn broke over the rain-washed city, Elena clocked out. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that seemed unnaturally clean and quiet. As she walked toward the bus stop, she glanced back at the monolithic building. From the outside, it was just as it always was, solid, imposing, and impenetrable. But Elena knew that something inside had broken. A life, as tangible and warm as that cooling cup of tea, had simply been erased from within its silent, secure walls. The knock came 2 days later, a sharp, authoritative rap on the thin wood of their apartment door that made both Elena and Sophia jump. 2 uniformed officers stood in the dim, narrow hallway, their bulk seeming to shrink the already small space. They were polite but firm, their questions a barrage of English that felt both formal and accusatory. Elena, with her mother's hand clutching her arm, answered in a quiet, halting voice. She described the argument, the time, the empty desk. She watched the younger officer's pen move across his notepad, his expression unreadable. Sophia stood beside her, a silent, terrified sentinel, her eyes darting from the officers' faces to their holstered guns, her body radiating a fear so profound it felt like a third presence in the room, a ghost from a past filled with men in uniforms. Detective Miller arrived at Croft, Sterling and Dunn that same morning, a man whose rumpled suit and weary demeanor were starkly out of place in the pristine mahogany and glass lobby. He was met not by a witness but by 2 of the firm's senior partners, men with tailored suits and cold, practiced smiles. They led him to a conference room that overlooked the Potomac, its air chilled to a precise temperature. Every question he asked was met with a calm, legally vetted response. They spoke of Sarah Jenkins in the past tense, expressing deep professional concern. The firm, they assured him, was a family, and they would cooperate fully. But Miller felt the invisible walls going up around him, the smooth, impenetrable fortress of money and influence closing ranks against the intrusion of an inconvenient truth. Julian Croft's interview was a masterpiece of controlled composure. He sat across from Detective Miller, his expression a perfect blend of sorrow and professional gravity. He confirmed he had spoken with Sarah that night, characterizing their conversation as a passionate debate over a difficult case. He mentioned, with feigned reluctance, that Sarah had been under significant personal stress, alluding to a recent and painful breakup. She was a brilliant paralegal, Croft said, his voice laced with practiced regret. But she was fragile, deeply so. He was painting a picture, carefully and deliberately, of a troubled young woman who might have simply walked away from her life. He was providing a narrative, A neat and tidy explanation that had nothing to do with a frantic argument in a darkened hallway. The news reached Sarah Jenkins's parents in suburban Maryland via a phone call that would forever divide their lives into a before and an after. Their daughter, the bright, ambitious girl who called every Sunday, was missing. Her father, a retired high school history teacher, drove into the city, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Her mother sat in the passenger seat, staring blankly at the passing scenery, clutching a worn photograph of Sarah from her college graduation. Their grief was a raw, disbelieving thing, a stark contrast to the polished statements being issued by the law firm. They were ordinary people thrust into an unimaginable nightmare, their simple suburban world colliding with a universe of power and secrets they could not begin to comprehend. Within 24 hours, the story was on the local news. News vans with tall antennas parked along the brick-lined Georgetown Street, their cameras aimed at the impassive facade of the law firm. Journalists ambushed employees on their way to work, shoving microphones in their faces. Sarah's smiling professional headshot was suddenly everywhere, on television, screens, on the front page of the morning paper. The narrative pushed by the firm and amplified by the press began to take hold. Bright young paralegal, troubled personal life, vanishes without a trace. The city was captivated by the mystery, a story of beauty, privilege, and potential tragedy that felt like something from a movie. A brief, dramatic distraction for a public that knew nothing of the real, human cost. Elena's formal interview took place in a small, windowless room at a police precinct, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. Detective Miller was patient, but the other officer in the room was not. He questioned her command of English, asked the same questions over and over, his tone laced with a barely concealed skepticism. "You're sure that's what you saw, Ms. Ramirez?" It was dark. There was a storm. Elena felt herself shrinking under the institutional glare, her certainty eroding with each repeated query. Her testimony, the only one that contradicted the official story, felt flimsy and unimportant. She was the cleaner, the invisible woman. Who would believe her over the word of a man like Julian Croft? She left the station feeling as though she had been the one accused of a crime. In the days that followed, photocopied flyers began to appear, taped to lampposts and the windows of coffee shops. They featured the same smiling photo of Sarah, with the word "missing" printed in bold black letters above it. Her friends organized search parties, combing through the wooded trails of Rock Creek Park, their hopeful calls of her name swallowed by the indifferent green canopy. Sarah's best friend, a young teacher named Chloe, spoke to a reporter, her voice shaking with anger. "The Sarah they're describing isn't the person I know," she insisted. "She was not fragile. She was a fighter. Something happened in that building." But her voice was just one among many, a cry of desperate loyalty lost in the rising tide of speculation, and the carefully crafted narrative of a runaway. In Columbia Heights, the disappearance was a topic of hushed conversations in the building's hallways and over the counter at the corner bodega. People looked at Elena with a mixture of pity and fear. They understood the power dynamics of the city better than anyone. To be a witness, especially a poor immigrant witness, was to be in danger. Mrs. Castillo from the third floor stopped Elena in the stairwell, pressing a small protective milagro charm into her hand. "Be quiet now, little one," she whispered in Spanish. "You have said what you saw. Now you must become a ghost again. For your mother." The advice was born of a deep historical wisdom, a knowledge that the justice system was not built to protect people like them. The investigation's momentum slowed to a crawl. A doorman at a neighboring building remembered seeing a dark sedan idling across the street late that night, but couldn't recall the make or model. A junior associate at the firm admitted that Sarah had been working on a sensitive merger case for Mr. Croft, one with powerful political implications, but he quickly backtracked when a partner overheard him. These small threads of information were noted by Detective Miller but led nowhere. They were whispers in a storm of official denials and legal stonewalling. The law firm provided security footage, but a glitch in the system meant the cameras covering the hallway near the records archive had not been recording that night. It was a coincidence too perfect to be believed. The newspapers began to fill the void with theories. One column suggested Sarah had a secret lover and had run off to start a new life. Another hinted at a connection to a high-profile case she was working on, speculating about corporate espionage. A tabloid even fabricated a story about a history of mental illness, citing anonymous friends. In all these narratives, Elena was a footnote, if she was mentioned at all. She was simply a cleaner who thought she heard an argument. Her testimony was stripped of its humanity and its certainty, reduced to a piece of unreliable data that clouded the more sensational and therefore more interesting possibilities. The truth was being buried under an avalanche of speculation, and Elena's voice was too quiet to be heard above the noise. Detective Miller felt the case slipping through his fingers. Every lead evaporated, every witness interview led to a dead end. Julian Croft had a verifiable alibi for the rest of the night, confirmed by his wife. The firm's lawyers shadowed Miller's every move, lodging formal complaints about his harassment of their employees. He was getting pressure from his superiors to focus on the runaway angle, to ease off the city's elite. He knew, with the gut certainty of a veteran cop, that the answer lay within the walls of that firm, with the charismatic man who projected such effortless calm. But he had nothing. No body, no weapon, no physical evidence, just the word of a terrified cleaning woman against a mountain of influence. Slowly, inevitably, the city began to move on. The news vans departed from Georgetown. The headlines were replaced by a new political scandal, a summer heat wave, the upcoming baseball season. The flyers with Sarah's face grew limp and faded in the sun and rain, their corners peeling away from the lampposts until someone eventually tore them down. The initial frantic energy of the search dissipated, leaving behind a profound and aching void. For the city, Sarah Jenkins was becoming a ghost, a piece of local lore. For her family, the void was a permanent gaping wound that would never close. The hope that had sustained them through the first few weeks began to curdle into the grim, unspoken acceptance of a loss they couldn't name. The experience settled inside Elena like a stone. She became even quieter, more withdrawn. She took a different bus route to work, unable to bear, passing the streets where Sarah's face had once looked out from the flyers. At the firm, she kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the floor, her Walkman turned up so loud it blocked out the world. The other employees, who had once ignored her, now sometimes watched her with a flicker of suspicion or pity in their eyes. She was a reminder of the unpleasantness, a loose thread in the building's otherwise perfect tapestry. Her invisibility, once a condition of her job, now became her shield. Conscious choice to retreat so far into the shadows that no one would ever notice her again. A few months after the disappearance, the law firm held its annual summer reception. From the street, Elena watched as elegantly dressed men and women spilled out onto a candlelit terrace, their laughter echoing in the warm night air. She saw Julian Croft standing in the center of a group, a glass of champagne in his hand, his smile as bright and confident as ever. He was a man completely untouched by the tragedy, his life continuing its seamless upward trajectory. The contrast was a silent, brutal confirmation of everything her mother had ever taught her. In this city there were two sets of rules, one for the people who laughed on terraces, and another for the people who cleaned up after them when the party was over. The void left by Sarah Jenkins was not empty, it was filled with silence. It was the silence of a family that stopped setting a place for her at the dinner table. It was the silence of friends who stopped saying when she comes back, and started saying if she comes back. It was the silence in Detective Miller's case file as it was moved from his active desk to a cold metal cabinet. And it was the silence Elena carried within her, the heavy weight of a truth she had seen but could not make anyone hear. The hope was gone, replaced by a quiet, simmering sense of injustice that would become the permanent, low-grade fever of the rest of her life. A constant, private reminder of the night a woman disappeared, and a part of Elena did too. The first year bled into the second with a brutal, seamless monotony. For Sarah Jenkins's family, time did not heal. It simply stretched their grief into a thinner, more transparent agony. Her 25th birthday passed in a shroud of suffocating silence. Her mother baked a cake, as she always had, a small yellow cake with chocolate frosting, and placed it on the dining room table. The single, unlit candle was a small, defiant monument. They sat around the table, her father staring at the empty chair, her mother tracing the patterns on the tablecloth with a trembling finger. The silence in the room a physical weight. The cake remained untouched, a sweet, heartbreaking testament to a celebration that would never happen, a life suspended in the amber of a single, terrible night. The ritual was a form of self-inflicted torture, a refusal to let the past become the past. Then came the fall of that year, and the world itself seemed to break. The towers fell in New York, the Pentagon burned just across the river, and the nation was plunged into a new, collective trauma. The disappearance of a single paralegal, once a compelling local mystery, was instantly rendered insignificant, a forgotten footnote in a city now consumed by fear and patriotism. The news cycles were filled with images of dust and wreckage, of soldiers and flags. Sarah's story was washed away in a tidal wave of national mourning. For the Jenkins family, it was a profound and isolating experience. Their private, unending tragedy now felt impossibly small, their grief a quiet whisper drowned out by the roar of history. The city had a new ghost to haunt it, one so large it eclipsed all the smaller, more personal specters that lingered in its shadows. In Columbia Heights, Elena built a fortress of work and silence around herself. She quit the job at the cleaning company, the thought of returning to that building a physical impossibility. With a small loan from a church fund, she started her own residential cleaning service, working grueling hours, scrubbing the homes of strangers, finding a perverse comfort in the sheer physical exhaustion. It left no room for thought, no space for the memory of a pale, frightened face in a lightning flash. She watched her mother, Sophia, grow more fearful, her warnings about staying invisible becoming a constant, whispered litany. The event had confirmed all of Sophia's deepest anxieties about this country, that its power was arbitrary, its justice reserved for the wealthy, and that for people like them, safety lay only in being forgotten. 5 years after Sarah vanished, her childhood bedroom remained a perfect, heartbreaking museum of a life interrupted. Her mother would go in every day, dusting the framed photographs on the dresser, smoothing the comforter on the bed. Her movements slow and ritualistic. The clothes still hung in the closet, their styles now subtly dated, the faint scent of Sarah's perfume clinging to the fabric like a ghost. Her father's hair had turned from gray to a stark, uniform white, and a permanent stoop had settled into his shoulders, as if he were carrying an invisible, crushing weight. They rarely spoke of her in direct terms anymore. Instead, she existed in the spaces between their words, in the long, shared silences that fell over them at dinner, in the way they both instinctively looked toward the door whenever they heard a car pull up outside. Meanwhile, Julian Croft's life ascended in a smooth, unbroken arc of success. He was made a full partner at the firm within 2 years of Sarah's disappearance. His face began appearing in the society pages, then in political journals. He moved his family to a sprawling estate in Virginia, his children photographed in matching polo shirts, his wife a portrait of elegant philanthropy. Elena would sometimes see him on the news, speaking with an easy, confident authority on matters of law and policy. Each time a cold, sick feeling would wash over her. He was a man whose world was built on a foundation of absolute impunity, his future paved over the spot where a young woman's life had simply ended. His success was a constant public refutation of the truth she carried, a loud, confident lie that drowned out her quiet, persistent memory. A decade passed. The Washington, D.C. that Elena had known was slowly being erased. The vibrant, chaotic streets of her Columbia Heights neighborhood began to change. The family-run pupuseria on the corner was replaced by an artisanal coffee shop selling $12 lattes. The sounds of merengue and bachata from open windows were gradually supplanted by the quiet hum of new air conditioning units. Rents skyrocketed, pushing out the families who had lived there for generations. It was called gentrification, progress. But for Elena it felt like another form of disappearance, another quiet erasure of the world that had held her. She felt like a relic, a holdover from a time and a place that no longer existed, her own history being plastered over and painted a neutral, fashionable gray, just like the secrets hidden in the city's heart. Detective Miller retired after 35 years on the force, a man worn down by the city's endless cycle of violence and compromise. The Sarah Jenkins case file, thick with dead-end reports and unanswered questions, went with him, not in a box, but in his memory. It was the one he couldn't shake, the loose thread that snagged at the corners of his mind on quiet nights. He would sometimes find himself driving through Georgetown, slowing down as he passed the imposing brick building, still seeing the ghostly image of faded flyers taped to the lampposts. He had known, with a cop's unshakable instinct, that the answer was inside that building. But instinct wasn't evidence, and the walls of power had proven too high, too thick to penetrate. The failure settled in his bones, a permanent low-grade ache of justice denied. 20 years on, Sophia's mind began to wander, the sharp edges of her memory worn smooth by dementia. She lived mostly in the present, but sometimes a storm or a loud, unexpected noise would throw her back into a state of primal fear. In these moments, she would clutch Elena's arm, her eyes wide with a terror whose source she could no longer name. Con cuidado, mija, she would whisper, the words a ghostly echo from another lifetime. No te metas en nada. Don't get involved. The warning had become unmoored from its original context, a piece of emotional shrapnel that had worked its way deep into her psyche. Elena, now in her 40s, would simply hold her mother's hand, her own life a long, quiet sacrifice to the ghosts of a past that had claimed them both in different ways. For Sarah's parents, the passage of 2 decades brought not peace, but a final, weary resignation. Her father passed away from a heart attack in the 18th year, a man who, his wife said, had simply died of a broken heart. Her mother, frail and lost in a world without him, moved into an assisted living facility. Sarah's room was finally dismantled, its contents packed into boxes and stored in a sterile, anonymous unit. The hope that had once flickered so fiercely had long been extinguished, leaving behind only the cold, gray ash of loss. There were no more anniversary cakes, no more expectant glances at the door. There was only the quiet, rhythmic ticking of a clock in a small, tidy room, marking time that no longer held any promise of a revelation or return, and the building itself, the silent stone witness at the heart of the story, also succumbed to the relentless march of time. Croft, Sterling & Dunn had merged with a larger firm a decade earlier, and the historic Georgetown office was eventually sold to developers. For a few years it stood empty, its windows dark and dusty, a hulking, forgotten monument to a bygone era of power. Then, the scaffolding went up, followed by the tall green fences of a construction site. The building was slated for demolition, destined to be reborn as luxury condominiums with river views. It seemed a fitting end, the final act of erasure. The place where a life had vanished was now, itself, about to disappear, its secrets seemingly destined to be buried forever under layers of new steel, glass, and concrete. In the summer of 2023, the old Croft, Sterling & Dunn building was a skeleton of its former self, a hollowed-out carcass of steel and crumbling brick under the relentless Washington sun. The air was thick with the chalky dust of demolition, the rhythmic crash of sledgehammers, and the groan of stressed metal, a constant, brutal symphony. On a sweltering August afternoon, a demolition worker named Marco, sweat stinging his eyes, swung his hammer against a stubborn section of wall in the sub-basement. It felt different. Instead of the solid thud of reinforced concrete, the wall gave way with a hollow, splintering crack. A foul, musty odor, the smell of time and decay, billowed out from the darkness behind it. He peered into the newly formed hole, his breath catching in his throat at the sight of a hidden man-made cavity that was never on any blueprint. Marco called over his foreman, an older, weary man who had seen his share of strange things on job sites. They shone their powerful work lights into the dark, narrow space. At first, it was just a jumble of shadows. Then, the beam settled on a large misshapen bundle on the dusty floor. It was wrapped in thick, dark tarps, the kind used by movers or construction crews, and bound tightly with old, brittle-looking electrical wire. There was a grim finality to the object, a deliberate concealment that spoke of something more sinister than forgotten storage. The foreman, a man named Sal, slowly lowered his flashlight, his face grim. He didn't need to get any closer. He had seen enough in his life to know when to stop asking questions and call the authorities. He ordered the crew to down tools, and a sudden profound silence fell over the site, heavier than all the noise that had preceded it. The arrival of the first police cruisers shattered the quiet, their sirens wailing through the manicured Georgetown streets. Within an hour, the demolition site was a full-blown crime scene, cordoned off with strobing lights and yellow tape that seemed garishly bright against the building's gray remains. Forensic teams in sterile white suits moved carefully through the debris, their professional solemnity a stark contrast to the gawking construction workers and gathering news crews. The discovery of human remains in such a storied location was a major event. For the city's older residents and veteran journalists, the news acted as a key, unlocking a dusty, forgotten room in their collective memory. Whispers began to circulate, hesitant at first, then with growing certainty. They were whispers of a ghost story, a cold case about a young woman who had vanished into thin air from this very building over 2 decades ago. Elena Ramirez, now 44, sat in the hushed, antiseptic quiet of a nursing home room, the air smelling faintly of lavender and bleach. Her life had narrowed to this small, peaceful space, a world defined by the quiet, rhythmic beeping of medical monitors and the soft, incomprehensible murmurs of her mother. Sophia, her once fierce eyes now clouded by the fog, of dementia, sat propped up in her bed, her gnarled hands fidgeting with the edge of a worn blanket. Elena was patiently spoon-feeding her mother a small bowl of lukewarm soup, the gentle scrape of metal on ceramic the only sound in their shared solitude. The local news played quietly on a small television mounted in the corner, its constant low-level chatter a familiar backdrop to their slow, unchanging afternoons. It was a life of quiet duty, a long, drawn-out penance for a past she had tried so hard to bury. Suddenly, a breaking news alert flashed across the screen, the accompanying chime making Elena flinch. The anchor's voice was serious, urgent. "We are coming to you live from Georgetown, where a gruesome discovery has been made." The screen cut to live footage of the demolition site, a place Elena had avoided for 22 years. She saw the police tape, the forensic vans, the familiar brick facade now reduced to rubble. Her hand, holding the spoon, froze halfway to her mother's lips. A cold, familiar dread began to creep up her spine, a feeling she hadn't experienced since she was a terrified young woman sitting in a sterile police interrogation room. She stared at the screen, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. The past was not buried. It was being excavated, live on television. The report continued, the camera zooming in on a press conference. The lead detective, a woman with tired, serious eyes, was speaking. She confirmed the remains were those of a woman and that the case was being treated as a homicide. Then she held up a small, clear evidence bag for the cameras. Inside, cleaned of the grime of 2 decades, was a small platinum pendant. It was fashioned into the shape of a delicate dragonfly, its wings a web of intricate, shimmering filigree. The detective asked for the public's help. "If anyone recognizes this unique piece of jewelry," she said, her voice steady, "please contact us immediately." Elena dropped the spoon. It clattered against the ceramic bowl with a sharp, explosive sound. Her breath hitched. She wasn't just looking at a piece of evidence. She was looking at a ghost from Julian Croft's office. The memory, long dormant, returned with a shocking crystalline clarity that erased the intervening years in an instant. She was 22 again, alone in the dead of night, dusting the vast, polished surface of his mahogany credenza. Her cleaning cloth had snagged the corner of a small, velvet-covered gift box from a famous Georgetown jeweler. It had tipped over, the lid falling away to reveal the pendant nestled on a bed of white satin. It had spilled onto the dark wood, catching the light from his desk lamp. She had picked it up, her fingers tracing the delicate wings for just a moment, struck by its beauty and expense. It was a secret, a gift intended for someone else. Feeling a pang of guilt, she had quickly and carefully placed it back in its box, righted it, and finished. Her work, the small, insignificant incident forgotten almost as soon as it happened. Now, sitting in the quiet nursing home room, the insignificant detail became the entire story. The horrifying truth settled upon her not with a crash, but with a slow, sickening weight. The dragonfly pendant hadn't belonged to Sarah Jenkins. It had belonged to Julian Croft. It was the gift he was planning to give, or perhaps the gift that was refused. It was the missing link, the one piece of physical evidence that tied the powerful, respected Congressman Croft directly to the body sealed behind a wall in the basement of his old firm. Her testimony, the words they had dismissed and dissected until they meant nothing, was true. Every detail, the frantic argument, the fear in Sarah's eyes, it was all real, and for 22 years, the proof had been lying in the dark, waiting. For a long time, Elena simply sat there, staring at the muted television screen. The initial shock gave way to a wave of cold, paralyzing fear. The same fear that had governed her life for decades. She could hear her mother's voice, a constant ghostly whisper in her memory. "Con cuidado, mija. No te metas en nada. Don't get involved." But her mother was no longer the woman who had said those words. She was a frail, gentle soul lost in her own past. And Elena was no longer the invisible, undocumented girl who cleaned up other people's messes. She was a citizen. She had a life, a business. She had a voice. Sarah's. Family, wherever they were, deserved to know. The detective had asked for help. The truth had finally clawed its way into the light. And it had found her. Her hand, trembling slightly, reached for her phone. She took a deep, shuddering breath. A breath that felt like it was pulling up 2 decades of silence from the depths of her soul. And dialed the number on the screen. When the operator answered, Elena's voice was quiet, but it did not waver. It was the voice of a woman who had carried a terrible weight for too long and was finally setting it down. "My name is Elena Ramirez," she said, the words feeling solid, real. I'm calling about the dragonfly pendant found in Georgetown. There was a pause as she gathered herself. I saw that pendant before. I know who it belonged to. There was no triumph in her voice, no anger, only a profound and bottomless sorrow. The long dark night of May 15, 2001, was finally, after a lifetime of waiting, surrendering to the dawn. The fall of Congressman Julian Croft was as swift and brutal as his ascent had been seamless. His carefully constructed life of power, respect, and familial grace shattered overnight. The pieces broadcast across every news channel in the nation. The dragonfly pendant became an icon of his deceit, a beautiful, delicate thing that held within its wings a story of unimaginable cruelty. Reporters camped outside Elena's small home, their cameras and microphones a ravenous, demanding presence. They offered her money, fame, a platform to tell her story. She refused them all, retreating deeper into the quiet fortress of her life. She had not spoken for triumph or for vengeance. She had spoken for a ghost, for a half-empty mug of tea left on a desk, and for the silent, nagging weight of a truth that had demanded, after 22 years, to finally be heard. Her silence in the face of the media storm was her final testimony. Sarah Jenkins was buried on a cool, overcast Tuesday in late September in a small church cemetery in the Maryland suburbs where she had grown up. The service was small, attended only by a handful of aging relatives and a few of her friends, their faces etched with the strange, disorienting grief of mourning a loss that was both fresh and 2 decades old. Her mother, a frail woman whose body seemed held together by sheer will, sat in the front pew, her gaze fixed on the simple, polished wooden casket. There was no catharsis in the air, no sense of righteous victory. The Siaobosi discovery of the body had not brought closure. It had simply given their abstract, unending pain a physical location. Justice had arrived, but it was a hollow, spectral thing. A guest who had shown up a lifetime too late for the funeral, offering condolences that could never mend the profound, irrevocable wound of a life stolen away. For Elena, the world had been irrevocably altered. Her invisibility, the shield she had spent a lifetime perfecting, was gone. On the street, strangers would sometimes stop and stare, their eyes holding a mixture of pity, admiration, and a morbid curiosity that made her skin crawl. She was no longer Elena Ramirez, owner of a small cleaning business. She was a character in a national tragedy, a symbol of the quiet persistence of truth. The new visibility felt like a violation, a harsh light exposing a part of her she had always kept hidden. She continued her work, scrubbing floors and polishing surfaces in other people's homes. The familiar, repetitive motions a fragile anchor in a world that now felt unsteady. She had done the right thing, she knew, but the peace she had expected to feel was absent, replaced by the disquieting sense of being a ghost who had been forced back into the world of the living. A month after the funeral, Elena drove to the assisted living facility in Maryland. She found Sarah's mother sitting in a small, sunlit garden, a book lying unread in her lap. Elena sat down on the bench beside her, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. The air was filled with the scent of late-blooming roses and the shared, unspoken weight of their history. Finally, Elena turned to the older woman, her voice quiet and thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words encompassing everything. The 22 years of silence, the dismissed testimony, the life her daughter never had. Sarah's mother did not reply. She simply reached out and took Elena's hand, her grip surprisingly firm, her fingers cool against Elena's skin. It was not an act of forgiveness or gratitude. It was a simple, profound acknowledgement of a shared, unutterable sorrow, a silent pact between the mother who lost her daughter and the woman who had never forgotten her. Back in the hushed, sterile quiet of her mother's room, Elena sat in the visitor's chair, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. Sophia was asleep, her breathing soft and even, her mind blessedly free of the past that had so thoroughly defined her daughter's life. The news on the corner television was about politics, about a new storm brewing in the Gulf, about the endless forward churn of the world. The story of Sarah Jenkins was already beginning to fade, becoming another layer in the city's dense, complicated history. Elena reached over to the small bedside table and picked up a framed photograph of herself as a young girl, standing beside a smiling, hopeful Sophia. Using the hem of her sleeve, she gently wiped a smudge of dust from the glass, her movement slow, practiced, and precise. She placed the picture back in its exact spot, its surface now perfectly clear, reflecting a quiet room where a long overdue silence had finally and irrevocably settled.